dives and the angle at which they dive. Before we start talking about diving, we need to talk about a couple of movements that go on before we actually dive. Whenever a goalkeeper sees a forward preparing to shoot, we do what's called stealing ground. We move towards the shooter. Okay? We're stealing ground. We're cutting down that angle by moving towards the shooter. Okay? What we're also doing is establishing linear velocity. Okay? We're running towards the shooter. That's the line. Velocity means the speed. Okay? At some point, we deviate from that line. That means we move off that line at an angle. Okay? So we move forward and we dive at an angle. We steal ground, dive at an angle. And what this angle is some way so we intercept the ball. Well, there's various angles we could dive at. Okay? Normally we think in terms of diving perpendicular to the line of the ball. Okay? That may or may not be the best case for each goalkeeper. We'll get a little bit deeper into that a little bit later. First, let's start off with what we talked about, stealing ground. Let's watch and see this performer, how they steal ground. And notice the footwork and then the preparation.
Hi, I got a tape I want to play.
To the facts, tense and nervous, can't relax, can't sleep, bed's on fire. Don't touch me, I'm unrealized why. Psycho killer, kiss me straight, run away.
Okay, did you notice how he moved forward, established that linear velocity, angled off towards the stage, and when he got to the microphone, both feet placed on either side of the microphone. David Byrne and the Talking Heads can teach us something about goalkeeping. Anyway, here's probably something that's a little bit more practical about stealing ground. Okay, good example of stealing ground there, good bit of goalkeeping. Okay, as you notice, the goalkeeper moving forward towards the shooter as the shooter controls the ball, prepares to shoot, positions himself to shoot. That goalkeeper is getting out, cutting down the angle. Okay, now that we've got that basic understanding, I think we're ready to go on to figure one. Okay, this is figure one. Figure one is an illustration of terms and ideas with respect to diving angle. First, we need to orient ourselves with this figure. Up here is the origin of this shot. This is chosen to be the center of the 18. So in other words, a forward standing dead center on the 18-yard line would shoot at a goal. If he shoots at either post, the intended flights of the ball are indicated by these dashed lines right here. Okay? I think the first thing that we can get from this diagram is, why do we steal ground? Well, if we position the goalkeeper here right on the goal line, it's pretty clear that the distance from the center of the goal to the intended flight of a shot at either post is greater than the distance from a goalkeeper situated at the 6-yard line to the intended flight of each shot. So it makes sense for a goalkeeper to come forward, decreasing the distance he's got to travel to the intended flight of the shot. Most successful goalkeepers will start somewhere in here. As the shooter prepares, they steal ground and then dive forward at an angle like this, somewhere between 0 and 45 degrees. Most unsuccessful goalkeepers will start somewhere in this area, steal ground, and then turn 180 degrees and move in this direction, where they return to the goal, pick the ball up, and give it to the referee. Now, what I wanted to study was, well, there are a lot of different angles the goalkeeper can dive at. The goalkeeper can dive at various angles in this sort of fashion. Okay? Which is the best angle? Well, first I had to consider 0 degrees. That's diving flat, parallel to the 6-yard line. And I decided that I would go all the way up to 45 degrees. Now from here, if I wanted to study these things, I needed to study the forces that we generate when we dive. So in order for me to study the effectiveness of diving at an angle of 0, 15, 30, and 45 degrees, I would need to study the forces generated as we dive in these directions. I had to study the x-force. The x-force is the force forward and backward. So in other words, as I dive this way and I plant my feet, there's going to be some wavering, and some of my weight will go forward and backward. Not all of it will go directly in this line. So I'd study the x-forces at each of these. How much wasted energy is spent creating force forward and backward when I wanted to go in this direction. The most important force is the y-force, and the y-force is the direction of the dive. So I wanted to be able to generate as much force as I could in the direction of each of these dives and find out which angle is going to create the most force. I'm going to compare that with which is the shortest distance and find out, well, what's going to be the best angle for goalkeepers to dive at. Okay, let's move on to the next step. Okay, as just mentioned, the next step for me was to figure out the distance that a goalkeeper situated at the center of the 6 has to cover in order to stop a shot directed at the upper 90. Okay? So I assumed that the goalkeeper stole ground and would lead from the center of the 6. I assumed that the forward was a good forward and was shooting it at upper 90, and I wanted to find out how much distance. That's going to vary at each of those angles, 0, 15, 30, and 45 degrees. In order for me to figure out these distances, it required the use of a calculator, obtainable at any local department store. It requires a pretty decent knowledge of geometry. You can obtain that at your local high school. Pad and paper. Okay, let's take a look at the resulting distances necessary to stop a shot at each of the significant angles, 0, 15, 30, 45 degrees. Okay, after all my calculations, I found the distance from the center of the 6-yard line to the flood of the ball, from the center of the 18-yard line to the upper corner of the goal. In other words, how far does a goalkeeper have to travel through the air from the center of the 6-yard line to intercept a ball that's traveling from the center of the 18-yard line to the upper corner of a goal. Okay? Not the distance across the ground or the distance up in the air, but the distance through the air. Okay? And I found for 0, 15, 30, and 45 degrees. I originally found that 15 degrees was the perpendicular flight to the ball. This is going to be the minimum distance, and we see that it's 9.288 feet. That's the minimum distance. So from purely a geometry or distance standpoint, this is the best angle to dive at. My question is it the most effective for humans in real life? Even though this is the shortest distance, I had the feeling that some of the other angles might pay off by greater force. Okay? Let's take a look at these other distances. At 0 degrees, 9.614 feet. At 30 degrees, 9.618 feet. At 45 degrees, 9.688 feet. Okay? Now, we can see that if we don't dive at the minimum distance, we're going to have to cover more ground. Well, at 0 degrees, we'd have to cover approximately 4 more inches. Same thing at 30 degrees. We've got to cover approximately 4 more inches. At 45 degrees, we've got to go 7 more inches just to cover the same shot that if we dove at 15 degrees. Okay? Let's see what all this means. Okay, now that I've got all these distances, I had to figure out what to do with them. Okay? I had to figure out how can I generate force at each of these angles, which is going to be the most force at each of these angles, and a couple of different other questions. The way I went about doing it was I utilized the research facilities of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And in fact, the president of the university became so interested in my work that he asked if he could contribute a little bit something to this video summarizing my work.
Well, I thought my razor was dull until I heard his speech. And that reminds me of a story that's so dirty I'm ashamed to think of it myself.
Okay, that wasn't really the president of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. But I did use their research facilities. I did use the force plate. Let's take a look at the data. First, we're going to look at the vertical forces, the force directly down. Okay, we're going to start off with the simplest force. That's the vertical force, the vertical downward force. If you'll notice, 0 degrees, 1436, 15 degrees, 1473, 30 degrees, 1472, 45, 1452. These are all pretty close, and they all are approximately 3,000 pounds per meter per second, so there's a lot of force. Well, there's no real difference in the maximum. There were a couple of differences as I hit the force plate. Let's take a look. Here I am at 0 degrees. When I dive flat at 0 degrees, I generate this spike to about 1,000 newtons. And then after I land, I propel myself off with, again, about 1450 newtons. When I dive at 45 degrees, notice the initial spike is a lot higher. So I land with a lot more force, but I come back down to about the same spot, and I generate about the same spot, around 1450. Okay, again, around 3,000 pounds per meter per second of force. So there's not a lot of difference there. We move on. Here's the X force. This is the force back and forth, how much I would wobble back and forth as I dove. If you notice, I start, I land, and I've got some negative force. So I'm leaning back, leaning forward, leaning back, and keep leaning back and forth throughout my dive. So in other words, there's a lot of leaning here instead of moving in the correct direction. Okay? When we look at 0 degrees, we see there is an awful lot of wavering there. Now this, when I compare it to 45 degrees, notice there's an initial landing where I sort of catch myself here by leaning back to catch myself, go, and again, it's a lot smoother. So there's a lot less wobbling back and forth here. I tend to be much more stable, down, up, and move, than I was at 0 degrees. So that's an encouraging sign. The lateral force. This is the diving force. This is the most important force regarding my dive. If you'll notice, 0 degrees, 394 newtons. 15 degrees, 391 newtons. 30 degrees, 521. 45 degrees, 643. Here's where the difference gets to be important. You remember at 15 degrees, this was the shortest distance, okay? But yet only 391 newtons of force. Here at 45 degrees, 643, okay? Not quite twice, but almost twice as much force generated at 45 degrees, and a lot more force even at 30 degrees than at 15 degrees. So here's where that trade-off might come. 30 degrees, 45 degrees, generating more force. We have to cover a somewhat larger distance. Remember, 4 more inches here, 7 more inches here. But yet, if you look at the increase in force, that might be part of the reason why it's better to dive forward at a greater angle. If we take a look at the exact trials, here at 0 degrees, we've got a negative, what I call a braking force. I hit the force plate in the direction I want to dive. But what happens is I lean back and I catch myself. So I go in the direction I want to dive at, and I rock back, almost like setting myself to go, and then I dive from there. Okay? So here's where I hit. I lean back and get set to go, and then I dive. Here's where my heel starts to push off, the ball of my foot pushes off, and my toe leaves the force plate. Again, notice we've got negative force right there. When we get to 45 degrees, you'll notice that we land and we generate force in the direction we want to dive. We slow down a little bit, but we don't get negative. We're still moving in the direction we want to dive in. Okay? So it's land, and we still keep moving in this direction we want to dive in. We're still generating force. Okay? Notice here this is a little bit smoother. Okay? So I probably don't have to rock off my heel quite as much. I can go straight off the ball of my foot, and there's where my toe leaves. Generating a lot more force here, no negative force. That's important. Okay, how fast do I dive? How quickly do I get off the ground? Well, the force plate measures how much time I'm spending on the ground during my dive. And you see at both 0 and 15 degrees, it's 0.45 seconds. Okay? At 30 and 45 degrees, 0.35 seconds. So in each of these dives, I'm on the ground for 1/10 of a second less than I'm on the ground here. Okay? This is important. I'm diving faster, and I'm also generating more force. It's starting to look like we may be able to dive more effectively at 30 and 45 degrees than at 0 and 15 degrees. Alrighty, plenty of graphs, plenty of data. Let's take a break. Whew. Take a deep breath. That was a lot of data, alright? And all those fancy graphs and all those numbers and so on, you take them all in and you may be saying, well, what has this got to do with me? Okay, how am I going to be a better goalkeeper by looking at all these numbers and graphs? That's a fair question. Let's sort of try and put the real purpose for this research into words for you. Okay, we found that the shortest distance for diving occurred at 15 degrees. Okay, now when you steal ground, you've got some linear momentum, some linear velocity forward. You'd like to keep as much of that as possible because that velocity can make you dive farther. Okay, you can generate more force when you dive using that linear velocity. Okay, we then talked a little bit about the stability. Now, if you dive after you move forward and make a sharp turn to either 0 or 15 degrees, you tend to wobble a little bit and not go straight in the intended direction you're trying to go. When you go forward and turn not quite so sharply, say between 30 and 45 degrees, you're able to dive more directly. You don't waver so much from the direction of your dive. You tend to go straight where you want to go. You don't lose as much force. Finally, we talked about speed. You also are able to dive faster. Because you don't have to change direction as much, you're able to hit the ground and go a lot quicker, 1/10 of a second, which you know in a dive is a lot of time. You're able to say that by diving forward. Now, the trade-off occurs. Well, we talked about the distance being longer. 30 degrees, 4 inches or so. At 45 degrees, 7 inches. There's where the trade-off occurs. Well, I have to dive farther. But if you can dive faster and with more force, you may be more effective as a goalkeeper. You may be able to dive and save more shots by diving more forward, even though you're diving farther distances, than if you dive the shortest distance but don't get quite as much speed or force. Okay, hopefully you understand the purpose for all this. Well, having established that we generate more force at 30 and 45 degrees, I wanted to answer one more question. Why? Why do I generate more force at 30 and 45 degrees than at 0 and 15 degrees? This is the last part of my research, and I promise you, really quickly going to try and go over this. First, I just want to give you a quick snapshot of how I went about obtaining the data. Okay? Diving in a gymnasium. Not too exciting, but here's just a quick snapshot of what I had to do. Okay, what I had to do in this phase was, as you saw, dive. Before that, I had to put joint markers on. I had to put reflective tape on my feet, my knees, my hips, my chest, my elbows, my hands. Okay? I had to have a little spot in the wall. I had to have my assistant toss the ball exactly at that spot. It was a real pain because a lot of times it wouldn't be, successful as far as tossing the ball there. We'd have to do it over again. So we spent an awful lot of time in the gymnasium diving like this. After having done that, I then went to a computer, and what I did was I called digitizing. I digitized the output of my trials. In other words, I took the computer, I ran with a mouse, a little hand mouse clicked at each joint marker. It would then take that image and put it on the computer. It gave me 60 pictures a second. Okay? It takes you roughly an hour to do 1 second worth of video. So it took me somewhere between 12 and 15 hours to actually digitize all this output. But what that did for me was it made me a little matchstick figure on the computer screen, which you may have seen in other sports, but it gave me a matchstick figure of myself moving and diving and landing. That matchstick figure, oh, it looks really cool, but why do we do it? Well, it does an analysis of the velocities of my feet, my knees, my hips, chest, elbows, and hands. All the points I digitized, the computer measures the speed. It can also measure the angles and the angular velocity, how fast those angles change of my knees, my hips, my shoulders, my elbows, my hands. All these different angles that change, the computer will measure it. All this information would hopefully tell me why I generated more force at 30 and 45 degrees than at 0 and 15. Okay, last diagram, I promise. Please stay with me on this one. Okay, this little matchstick guy is me. Okay? legs, there and there, arms, here, upper arm, lower arm, body, arms, legs, body. Alright, I know I'm skinny, but I'm not this skinny. This is just the matchstick guy. Okay, the top dive is at 0 degrees, the bottom dive is at 45. This top line, that's the path that my hip took as I moved. This is the path of my left knee. The path of my hip, the path of my left knee. Okay, well, first of all, why the left knee? Well, the left knee is important because that's the side I was diving to, so that the left knee is going to be important because that's where I generate a lot of the force. Okay, why the hip? Well, the hip tends to show the stability or how much I drop when I step. So that these two things I thought would be key considerations into the force I generated when I dive. And here's the results. I think that I'm a bit unstable here. If you notice, my hip is moving a little bit here. Okay, it's coming up while my knee is still there. As opposed to, if you look here, these lines tend to move pretty much in sync. Okay? Here's probably, of the all the points regarding this diagram, the most important point. Look at how wide this is. That's where I drop my knee and I pre-stretch. Because it's wide, that means it's taking a lot of time. Here it's much shorter. Okay? So that my knee contracted and expanded much quicker. Contracts and goes up here a little bit slower. Okay? So that the speed at which the knee pre-stretches and explodes here is much faster than here. The speed at which the knee explodes generates the most force. So that this dive generated a lot more force because of that speed than this dive. Alrighty, let's move on. Whew. Made it through the diagrams, okay? Now, let's try and see how we can put this into practice. We talked a lot about establishing linear velocity. That's important. It's important for you to get out towards the shooter as they prepare to shoot. Okay? Sometimes you end up going all the way to the shooter, and you end up making what we call a smothering save. Okay? Here's an action shot of that.
He puts it over. Nice flick on the left side here to Bruce Murray. Murray looking forward to Philip Jow. Jow's onside. The shot, the save by Steffen. Oh, my goodness.
Excellent play.
That was a great flick on the part of Brian Haynes all the way over
once
on the right side.
Once that ball is played out to Haynes there, you see Marin, he gradually falls away from your screen, although he does it excellently in trying to get back, but he doesn't in the end. And there's that loose ball comes down. Murray sees the run, and he puts it first time. And there's the shot by Philip, just blocked by the goalkeeper.
A corner kick coming up here. Good work on the part of Bill Steffen. The corner kick now.
Okay, you can see there the keeper establishing linear velocity out towards the ball and the shooter. Okay, actually at that point got so close, stole enough ground so that it wasn't really so much of the shot as just a smother of the shot. Okay, when you move out and establish a linear velocity, you want to get as fast as you can, but you also have to stay under control, because obviously as you come forward, the shooter and the forward, they'll adjust. So they may move and you may be running past them like a wild horse. You got to stay under control so you can adjust as the forward adjusts.
Bruce Murray. Jow turns on Gwynn. Jow is off to the races again. Jow looking to play it to John Abe. Abe's got it. The goalkeeper's out, and it's off Steffen's body. We have a corner kick coming up here again for the Maryland Bay. So Jow creating a lot.
Okay, again, good work by the goalkeeper because he went forward and he adjusted and he stayed with the forward as the shooter kept coming down and tried to go around him. The keeper was able to adjust and control himself to stay in line and block the ball out for a corner. All right? We've talked a lot about going forward. Occasionally you have to go backwards. Occasionally you have to dive backwards. It's important to use correct technique when you go backwards. Okay? You want to be effective, you want to keep the ball out of the net, diving backwards, use correct technique. Bad form there by Curly or what? Let's take a look at a backwards dive that's a bit more effective.
Under a minute left to go. Again, that's the unofficial time. The official time is kept on the field by the referee. Capitals leading the Bolts 3-2. Tuttle with a corner. Driven ball, header! Steffen saves over the bar.
Great save by Steffen.
So close for the Bulls to tying right there off the header from Mike Sweeney. You see this?
Whew. Definitely better form than Curly there. Anyway, as I said, sometimes you can use that linear speed forward. Other times you're going to have to use it laterally, okay? You'll have to take that speed and not so much go forward, but move to the side as the ball moves across. Okay, let's take a look.
Back to Desmond Armstrong. Now Armstrong weaving through traffic. Armstrong still with the ball. He's got Zhao on the left. Turns in the middle, plays it to Johnny Abe. Abe now sends it wide. This is Zhao. Zhao one-on-one with Gwynn. Puts it across the goal mouth. Kevin Sloan, the shot, the save by Steffen. Mariner is there to put it over the end line. Amazing save and an amazing shot by Kevin Sloan.
It was a wonderful build-up there, and of course when the cross came over, Kevin Sloan got full contact onto it and drove it into the goalkeeper. The goalkeeper acted spontaneously and the ball bounced off him more than there is save.
Plays it
There's
wide
the
to
cross.
Zhao.
And he makes
Sloan,
great
Steffen.
connection there. Smythe gives the corner kick away.
Now Murray takes the...
Okay, so we saw a little bit of lateral velocity there. Okay, that's important as well. Here's another example, lateral velocity, and then you can see that quick pre-stretch. Don't stay in the crouch long, drop and pop. Okay, here's another one, let's take a look.
Now Philip Zhao looking to create some space, chips it in the box. Harbor, the header, save, Bill Steffen. Jackson heads it over the touchline.
Wonderful play there by Philip Zhao because everyone thought he was going to give it a... Here we are again on a corner.
The corner, oh, and now it's Harbor with the handball as it was, as it was Haynes that took that one, and it was Harbor that tried to slam dunk it.
I think everyone thought that Philip was going to give that ball to Abe, and everybody was kind of looking at Abe to receive the ball, where he clipped it across to the far post, where Gene made a great header, and it was a great save by the goalkeeper.
Well,
there's the cross.
There's the first one. That's the save by Bill Steffen.
Reactionary shot, yes. And
Okay, let's bring this all together and talk about application. What we talked about was stealing ground, moving towards the forwards as they prepare to shoot. We're trying to diminish the distance between the goalkeeper and the intended flight of the ball. Stealing ground can do that. We talked about diving, how you can dive at various angles. The minimum distance you've got to go is about 15 degrees, but it's probably to our advantage to dive a little bit more forward than that, between 30 and 45. It is a longer distance by somewhere between 4 to 7 inches, but we generate almost twice as much force. That might be a key consideration in diving. Diving forward as opposed to flat or 15 degrees. Okay? Let's take a look at hopefully a bit of action that can sort of summarize and put an application on this all together.
DeMatteis lays it off. Joe Cozio, that's Sweeney to Tuttle. Tuttle beats his man. Shot! Saved by Steffen.
Great move by Tuttle.
John Tuttle beat his man on the one-on-one. He had Rob McCourt defending.
He left McCourt in the dust.
And look at this play again. Got him to the right and just flicked it over to his left foot.
Okay, good piece of action there to sort of summarize everything we talked about. One more factor to consider that we talked earlier about that we should mention again was going backwards. Remember, when you go backwards, effective technique means not landing flat on your back. Landing flat on your back can cause injuries.
Oh, look at this now. His throw to the top of the cage. Hogan hanging on. He's choking him with the steel bar. But look now. Hogan trying to set up the boss man. Could it be a suplex? Yes, you can't believe it. Never seen a suplex off the top of the cage before.
That bad technique will cost you every time. As I said, it can cause injuries. Okay, let's get a little bit more of action before we're done here.
Right down the pike, he let a screamer go and sent Steffen rather with no chance.
Hey, how'd that get in there? I can always edit that out later. Let's take a look at some really better action.
That's Hennessy. Loops it in. Steffen makes the play.
But again, that high ball to the middle of the goal at the far post is not what you're going to do against this Steffen. He's not a big keeper, but he plays very well in the air.
Has strong legs. He really gets around quickly. It gets up in the air quickly.
Okay, I feel better now. Well, that sort of wraps things up for me. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. Didn't mean to tease you so much with the David Burns Talking Heads goalkeeper instructional video.